It was a dark, stormy night. The kind of night that makes you feel like the world outside is closing in, as if the rain and wind are trying to take over everything. For some, it's the perfect atmosphere to curl up with a book or watch a movie. But for others, it's the kind of night that makes your skin crawl, where the shadows seem deeper and every creak of the house echoes like a warning. Have you ever been alone at night, when the storm outside seems like it's getting closer with each passing second? The wind howls, the rain taps on your windows like 1,000 tiny fingers, and the darkness inside feels heavy, as if it's waiting for something to happen. It's in these moments, in the stillness of the night, that your mind begins to wander. You hear noises, small things at first. A faint knock on the door, the soft shuffle of feet upstairs, or maybe even the sound of breathing, though you're the only one in the house. But you can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. Meet Sarah, a young woman who found herself alone on one of those nights. She had just moved into a quiet little house on the outskirts of town, hoping for peace and solitude. She thought the old house had charm, creaky floorboards, a fireplace that flickered just enough to give off that comforting glow. But what Sarah didn't know was that this house had a story, one it had been waiting to tell. It started like any normal evening. The rain started as a soft drizzle, almost peaceful. But as the hours passed, the storm grew fiercer. The wind picked up, slamming against the windows with force, rattling the panes like the angry hands of an unseen force. Sarah, who was curled up on the couch reading a book, had no idea that this night would be unlike any other. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. She tried to calm herself, reminding herself that it was just a storm. But then the strange things started happening. The lights in the hallway flickered in a way that didn't seem normal, too random, too purposeful. And from the corner of her eye, she swore she saw something move in the darkness. Just a shadow, but it was enough to make her heart race. A loud bang came from upstairs, followed by a soft thud. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it the wind? A tree branch hitting the roof? Or was something or someone up there? Sarah wasn't alone, not really. She had an uneasy feeling that she wasn't the only one in the house. But every time she tried to convince herself it was just the storm, another sound would break the silence. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, crept in like a dark cloud. Every creak of the floorboards felt like it was closer. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was when she tried to leave. The front door, which had always opened without a problem, wouldn't budge. She yanked at the handle, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Was it just the wind? Was it locked? She didn't know. She didn't want to know. The storm outside raged on. But now, it felt different, more sinister. The wind howled like a warning, and the rain seemed to pound harder against the walls. She looked around the house. The living room was still, save for the dim light from the fireplace, casting long shadows across the room. But she could hear something now. A faint tapping, almost like nails on the walls. It wasn't the rain. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. Sarah's mind raced. Could someone else be in the house? Maybe it was a prank, but why did it feel so real? She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, but as she turned to head for the stairs, she froze. The door to the basement, which she had been sure she locked earlier, was now slightly ajar. And from the dark space beyond, she could hear something moving, something breathing. Every part of her screamed to run, to get out of the house, but the storm outside was no less terrifying. What if something worse was waiting for her out there in the storm? As she stared at the basement door, her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the presence now, closer, watching her from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And then, just as she was about to take a step forward, the sound came again. But this time, it was much louder, much closer. The unmistakable sound of breathing hot, ragged, and far too close for comfort. Sarah's mind raced with fear, but her feet were frozen. What was in the house with her? Was it the storm or something far worse? As the wind howled and the house creaked, she had no idea what would happen next. Would she make it out alive? Or was this the night the house decided to claim its next victim? As she turned to face the basement door one last time, the shadows seemed to stretch out, almost as if they were reaching for her. Would she survive the night? Or would she become just another forgotten soul in the house's long, dark history? You'll have to wait and see. Sarah stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing as she stared at the basement door. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, like invisible eyes were studying her every move. She wanted to turn and run, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself had a hold on her, trapping her in this terrifying moment. The rain battered the windows. The wind screamed through the trees, but inside, it was eerily silent except for the breathing. The sound wasn't just close now, it was inside the house. It was almost as if it was coming from within the walls, behind the door, or even underneath the floorboards. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. What was that sound? She forced herself to take a small step toward the basement door, but as she did, something unexpected happened. The air in the room shifted. A cold draft swept through, colder than the storm outside. Her skin prickled as if the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in an instant. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the doorframe, and as her fingers brushed the wood, the unmistakable feeling of something wrong crept over her. It was as if the door wasn't just old, it felt heavy, as though it had been untouched for years. But she knew that couldn't be true. She had opened it when she first moved in. Her thoughts scrambled as she tried to make sense of everything. She could have sworn she had locked the basement door earlier that day, but it was open now, and she didn't remember unlocking it. Panic bubbled inside her, but she held it down, trying to breathe steadily. This was all in her head, she told herself. The stress of moving, the isolation, the storm, all of it had gotten to her. But as she took another step, something made her pause. It wasn't the wind, nor the storm, it was a sound. A soft scratching noise, like nails dragging across a surface. It came from the basement, followed by a low growl, barely audible over the storm. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't imagining this. Something or someone was down there. The growl faded, but the silence that followed felt worse. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, creeping slowly toward her, growing darker with every passing second. She backed away from the basement door, her pulse racing, but her body felt paralyzed. She wanted to run, to scream, but the sound of her heartbeat in her ears drowned everything else out. And then, a noise sharp and sudden came from upstairs. It was a loud bang, followed by a shuffling sound. Sarah's head snapped up. She wasn't alone. The house wasn't just old and creaky. Something was moving in it, something that shouldn't be there. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to get out of the house. But the rain outside made it impossible to escape. She couldn't stay in the house, but she didn't want to face whatever was waiting out there in the storm either. She was trapped. Desperately, she turned toward the front door, hoping that the wind had somehow unlocked it while she wasn't paying attention. She rushed to it, pulling at the handle with all her strength, but it didn't budge. The door was still locked, still sealed shut. She let out a frustrated cry and slammed her fist against the wood, but the noise of the storm outside drowned out her desperation. And then, just as she was about to turn and look for another way out, she heard something else, footsteps. Not from upstairs this time, but from right behind her. A soft, almost imperceptible shuffle of feet on the old floorboards. It was as if someone was walking just a few steps away, following her, and Sarah could feel the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was no one there. No one standing in the living room, no one in the doorway to the kitchen. And yet she could feel the air growing thick as if something was pressing in on her from every direction. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. She was sure of it. It felt wrong, unnatural, like something much darker was lingering, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her thoughts raced. What was in the house with her? What did it want? Why was it tormenting her like this? The basement door, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched, all of it felt connected, like a twisted puzzle she couldn't solve. The room grew colder, the shadows longer. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, and she felt a strange pressure in her chest, as if something was slowly suffocating her. The air was thick, filled with an energy that made her feel dizzy. She needed to get out, but the house was closing in on her, its dark corners and hidden spaces seeming to hold 1,000 secrets. She couldn't trust her own senses anymore. Every creak, every whisper of wind seemed to have a meaning, a purpose. The scratching sound from the basement returned, louder this time, followed by a low growl. It was closer. It was getting closer. And then, suddenly, the light flickered. Once, twice, and then it went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness. The kind of darkness that made you feel utterly alone, as if the world had disappeared and there was nothing left but you and the unknown. Sarah's heart raced in the silence, the darkness wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. What was waiting for her in the dark? What was it that was moving in the shadows, that had been watching her all night? She stood there, frozen, her mind screaming at her to move, to do something. But there was nowhere to go, no way to escape. She had no choice but to face whatever it was that was lurking in the house, waiting for her. And just as she took a step forward, a voice echoed in the darkness. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a growl. It was a soft, almost tender voice, a voice that was unmistakably human. Sarah. Her blood ran cold. The voice was coming from somewhere deep within the house. Was it real? Or was it just another trick the house was playing on her? And then the door to the basement creaked open. The basement door creaked open slowly, as if it were reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears, the sound of her racing heart louder than the storm outside. The darkness beyond the door seemed to swallow up the light, the air heavy with the weight of something waiting in the shadows. She couldn't make out any details, only a vast emptiness that felt colder than the night air itself. The voice from the dark still lingered in her mind, echoing in a way that made it impossible to shake. Sarah. It wasn't just the sound of the word, it was the way it was said, so soft and familiar, like a whisper from a long-lost friend or a memory that had been buried deep within her. Her legs trembled as she stood frozen, unable to move. Her eyes were locked on the basement doorway, her every instinct screaming at her to run. She could feel the presence from within the house, lurking just out of sight, watching her, waiting for her next move. But where could she go? The house felt like a prison, and the storm outside had turned the world into a blur of water and wind. She was trapped. The voice came again, closer this time, almost as if it was just behind her. Sarah. It was softer now, almost pleading. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing there. Just the same cold, empty room, the same eerie stillness that had settled over everything. She knew she wasn't imagining it. The house was alive in a way that made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the wind or the storm, there was something more, something darker at play here. She turned back to the basement door, feeling a strange pull toward it, as though it was calling her, urging her to step into the darkness. But she couldn't bring herself to move. Something was wrong. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had only moved into this house a week ago. She had been excited to start fresh, to leave the chaos behind. But now, it felt like the house was slowly unraveling her, piece by piece. Was it the house itself? Or was it something else, something that had been waiting for her? The longer she stood there, the more she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The house had been abandoned for years before she moved in. No one had lived here for decades, and yet it felt as if someone or something was still there, still tied to the walls, to the rooms, to the very air. Her mind flashed back to the day she had first stepped inside. She remembered the realtor's hurried words, how she had brushed aside the old man's warnings about the house being too quiet and unsettling. She had thought it was all nonsense, just an old man's stories to make the place seem more desirable. But now, standing in the middle of the living room with the basement door open before her, those words echoed in her mind. Was it too quiet? Was it really just an old house? Or was there something more sinister at play? The storm raged louder, and the wind howled outside, rattling the windows, shaking the very foundation of the house. But inside, it was still, deadly still. Sarah could feel the presence again, moving just out of sight, shifting in the dark. She had to know what was down there. She had to face it, whatever it was. With a deep breath, she took a step toward the basement, her legs feeling like lead. She reached for the door handle, her hand shaking uncontrollably, and pulled it open the rest of the way. The stairs leading down into the basement were just as dark, just as inviting as the rest of the house. The air that rushed up from below was thick with dust and a strange, musty odor, like something had been buried in the dark for years. It was the kind of smell that made her stomach turn. But it was the silence that unnerved her the most. There was no sound from below, no scurrying, no breathing. Just the oppressive quiet of something waiting in the dark. She stepped down the first stair, then another and another, her feet moving without her consent. She had to know. She had to find out what was in this house with her. Each step seemed to echo in the hollow space, amplifying the tension, stretching the silence until it felt unbearable. She was almost halfway down when the air grew colder, the chill sinking into her bones. The scratching sound returned, but this time it wasn't just from the walls, it was coming from below, as though something or someone was moving on the floor. The noise was soft at first, but it grew louder, sharper, like claws scraping against stone. Her heart raced as she reached the bottom of the stairs. The darkness here was absolute. She couldn't see a thing. The shadows stretched out, hiding whatever was lurking just beyond the reach of her senses. She tried to steady her breathing, but it came in quick, shallow gasps. Her hand trembled as she reached for the light switch, But before she could flip it, a sound broke through the silence, one she could never forget. A low, guttural growl. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was real. Her eyes widened in fear. Something was down here with her. Then, without warning, the light flickered and buzzed, casting fleeting glimpses of the basement in the darkness. She could see the shapes of old furniture, boxes piled high, but nothing seemed to move. The growl came again, louder this time, and it was followed by a soft whisper. A voice, familiar and unsettling. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come." The light flickered one last time and then died, leaving her standing in the pitch-black basement, her pulse pounding in her ears, her every instinct screaming at her to leave. But her feet wouldn't move. She was stuck, trapped in the dark, with something just beyond her reach, something that had been waiting for her. And then, shape shifted in the corner, just out of her sight. A shadow. Something with eyes that glinted in the dark. It was waiting, watching, and Sarah realized, with a sickening twist in her stomach, that she had already made a terrible mistake. She was not alone in this house, and whatever was here, it wasn't going to let her leave. The darkness in the basement was suffocating, the kind of darkness that pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Sarah's heart hammered in her ears as she slowly took a step backward, her feet sliding on the cold concrete floor. She didn't dare take her eyes off the corner where the shape had shifted. The shadow moved, just a flicker, but it was enough to freeze her in place. "Sarah." The voice came again, clearer this time, yet still wrapped in the eerie whisper of the basement. It was a soft sound, but it was so sharp, so clear, it sent a jolt of ice through her spine. She didn't know who or what was calling her, but the familiarity of it made her blood run cold. It was the voice of someone she knew, someone she had heard before, but from where? Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of it all. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the walls, as if the house itself was shifting, stretching in time with the storm outside. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, inch by inch, and she had nowhere to go. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs refused to move, locked in place by the unseen force around her. Then, the air grew even colder. Sarah's hands trembled, her fingers numb as she clenched them into fists, trying to steady herself. She could see the faintest outline of the basement boxes stacked in the corners. An old chair pushed against the wall, dust-covered shelves full of forgotten objects. But in the shadows, she could make out shapes that didn't belong. Her eyes flickered to the far corner again. The shadow was larger now, taking form. It was almost human, but not quite. It didn't have the right shape, the right proportions. It was wrong. It was wrong in a way that made her stomach turn, her throat closing up. She tried to call out, but the words stuck in her throat, choked by fear. Another growl. A low, animalistic sound that vibrated through the floor, making the hairs on her neck stand on end. It wasn't a creature, not like anything she had ever heard before. It was something older, something with a voice that felt like it belonged to the house itself. Something that had been here long before she ever set foot in the door. The air was thick now, as though the house was drawing in a breath, holding it, waiting. She could almost taste the tension, a sickly, metallic flavor on her tongue. Her mind raced. What was this thing? Was it real? Or was it just a trick of the house? Was it just her imagination playing tricks on her in the dark? But even as she thought this, she knew deep down that it was more than that. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't in her head. It was something far worse. Something alive. The whisper came again, sharper this time, as if it was right next to her ear. "Sarah, come closer." The words dripped with something dark, something sinister. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Without thinking, her feet moved on their own, taking a step toward the corner. The chill in the air deepened, and the growl grew louder, more insistent. A horrible, gut-wrenching feeling settled in her stomach, like the weight of something terrible pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She knew that whatever was in that corner, it wasn't waiting to help her. It was waiting to claim her. Her eyes darted around the basement, looking for something, anything that could protect her. But there was nothing. No weapons, no tools, nothing but the oppressive shadows that filled the space. The voice continued, beckoning her closer, pulling her in like a string wrapped tightly around her chest. "Sarah, come closer." A flash of movement caught her eye. For a moment, she thought she saw something shifting, something emerging from the darkness. A figure, tall and hunched, with eyes that glowed faintly in the shadows. It moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like it wasn't fully tethered to the world she knew. It was as if it was made from the same darkness that surrounded it, a creature born of the house itself. Her breath hitched as her mind raced. Was this the thing that had been calling her all along? The thing that had been whispering her name? She took another step, and then another, each movement slower, heavier, as if the air itself was trying to hold her back. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, until it felt like the sound would drown everything else out. The growl came again, but this time it wasn't just from the shadows. It was coming from all around her, from every corner of the basement, echoing off the walls like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. The cold in the air became unbearable, like she was standing in the heart of a winter storm, but the wind was still. The temperature seemed to drop by degrees, each one colder than the last, until she couldn't feel her fingers or toes. "Sarah," the voice, soft but firm, called her name once more. It was closer now, almost in her ear. She could feel it, like a breath on her neck. And in that moment, she knew. She knew that this was no accident. This wasn't just a haunted house. This wasn't just a shadow. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for her. It had been waiting for her to make the wrong move, to walk too close to the edge. Her pulse raced, and she tried to turn, tried to run, but her legs refused to obey. She was trapped, caught in the web of something she couldn't escape. Her body trembled, her muscles screaming for her to move, but her feet stayed glued to the spot. The growl turned into a low hiss, and the figure in the corner stepped forward, its face emerging from the darkness. But before she could see it clearly, everything went black. Darkness swallowed everything. For a moment, Sarah felt suspended in time, as if the world had come to a standstill. The air was cold, too cold, and she couldn't move. Her heart was still pounding, faster now, and her breath came in shallow gasps. She reached for her face, trying to feel something, anything, but there was nothing. The feeling of her fingers slipping through empty space, unable to touch anything solid, made her stomach churn. Her eyes fluttered open, but all she saw was darkness. Thick, impenetrable blackness. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was like the darkness had substance, like it was something alive, pressing against her, suffocating her. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the silence, as if the very air around her was too thick for sound to travel. Then there was a shift, a small sound, like a whisper, or maybe a breath. and then more footsteps. The sound was close, too close. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel the presence of something moving. It was walking toward her, slow and deliberate. Her chest tightened, her breath hitching as she strained to hear. She wanted to scream again, but the words stuck in her throat, frozen by fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the darkness lifted, and Sarah blinked against the sudden burst of light. She was back in the basement, but everything felt wrong. The familiar walls, the damp air, the old shelves stacked high with forgotten things, none of it was comforting anymore. The basement now felt like a tomb, cold and unwelcoming, as if the house itself had changed in some way. And in the center of the room, the figure was still there. It was closer now. Sarah could see it clearer than before. The shadow, that flickering outline, was no longer just a blur in the corner. It had form, a human form, but not human. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, jagged limbs that twisted unnaturally. Its face was obscured, but there was something about its eyes. Something empty, hollow. They glowed faintly, not with light, but with an absence, a deep void that seemed to suck the light from the room itself. The figure didn't move, but Sarah could feel its presence. It was as if it was waiting for something, waiting for her. She instinctively stepped back, her foot slipping against the wet floor, but the figure didn't approach. It didn't have to. The air around her seemed to grow heavier, the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Her throat tightened. She could barely breathe. Then, in the corner of her eye, she saw something else. It was quick, a flash of movement in the darkness beyond the figure, something that shouldn't have been there. A glimpse of something small, crawling, its hands scraping against the concrete floor, dragging itself closer. It was another shape, another figure, this one smaller, but just as unsettling. Before she could even comprehend what was happening, the ground beneath her seemed to tremble, a low rumbling sound shaking the basement, like the entire house was shifting. A groan filled the room, a sound so deep it felt like it was coming from the very foundation of the house. Sarah staggered, her hand gripping the cold wall for support, but the floor beneath her feet seemed to pull away, as if the house was tearing itself apart. And then, another sound. A voice, clearer now, like 1,000 whispers layered over each other. "Leave now, before it's too late." The words were sharp, urgent, a warning. But who was speaking? Who was trying to warn her? The figure in the corner remained motionless, its hollow eyes fixed on her, as if it was waiting for her to understand something she couldn't quite grasp. Sarah's pulse raced. She had to leave. She had to get out of here, but the door was blocked now, as if it had been sealed shut while she wasn't looking. The basement was changing, warping around her, and she couldn't escape. Suddenly, there was a scream. It wasn't her scream. It wasn't anyone she recognized, but it was sharp, desperate, filled with pure terror. The sound seemed to echo through the walls, bouncing off the corners of the basement. Sarah's heart froze. The scream didn't stop. It grew louder, longer, more frantic with each passing second, until it felt like the sound was coming from inside her own head. She turned frantically, her eyes darting to every corner, searching for the source of the scream. But there was nothing. Nothing but the growing darkness and the oppressive silence that followed the scream. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the scream cut off. Silence. Pure silence. Sarah stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. Her mind raced in 100 different directions, trying to process what was happening. The house was alive, in some twisted way. It wasn't just haunted, it was aware of her. It was calling to her, pulling her deeper into its dark, twisted heart. The shadow in the corner stirred. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to glow brighter now, its twisted form flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. It was no longer just a shape. It was something else, something more. And just as Sarah felt a surge of panic rise in her chest, something else happened. The ground beneath her feet cracked, a sharp, jagged line splitting the concrete open. And from the crack, a hand emerged, pale, claw-like, with fingers that scraped the floor with a horrible screech. The hand pulled itself out, dragging a twisted figure behind it. And this time, Sarah couldn't hold back the scream. The hand dragged itself across the floor with a terrifying sound, nails scraping the concrete. Sarah could feel the air around her growing thicker, the oppressive presence closing in on her. She couldn't move. Her legs were frozen, her body rigid with fear. Her heart hammered in her chest, threatening to burst from the intensity of it all. The figure in the corner, still watching her, stirred again, its hollow eyes narrowing as it began to take a slow step forward. Everything around her seemed to collapse inward, like the walls of the house were closing in on her, pushing her closer to the horror that was unfolding before her. She finally found her legs, her body acting on pure instinct as she stumbled backward, trying to get away from the nightmare. Her breath was ragged, her chest tightening with every step. But the door was still sealed shut, as if mocking her desperate need to escape. The crawling figure, the one with the gnarled hand, pulled itself closer, its movements erratic, jerking like something too broken to move properly. Its face, if you could call it a face, was twisted, barely human, like a dark mirror of the figure in the corner. It was closer now, so close Sarah could feel its cold breath against her skin, a smell of decay and something worse, something ancient. With a burst of panic, Sarah lunged forward, slamming her shoulder against the basement door. She screamed, rattling the door handle with both hands. It didn't give. It didn't budge. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But every movement she made seemed to push her further into the grasp of the shadows, pulling her deeper into the room that was now becoming a grave. Her hands were shaking. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and her eyes darted between the figures closing in on her. And then, suddenly, a voice. Stop. It wasn't the whisper she had heard before. This voice was clear. It rang through the basement like an order, strong and powerful. Sarah froze. The figures, for a moment, stopped too. Time seemed to pause, and the silence that followed was even more unnerving than the sounds that had filled the room just moments ago. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall, silhouetted against the dim light. It was a man. No, a boy, someone she knew. Someone she had seen in the house before, but not like this. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were old, out of time. He stepped forward, and the figures backed away as though his presence held some sort of power over them. But something was off. The boy's movements were stiff, unnatural, and his eyes, they weren't right. Sarah, he said again, his voice now cold, detached, as if it wasn't even him speaking. You've been warned. The shadowy figures began to twitch again, moving with a renewed urgency, but Sarah wasn't listening to them anymore. She was focused on him, on this boy. He was the key. She could feel it. But what had happened to him? Where had he come from? Why was he helping her now, after everything that had happened? Get away from me, Sarah yelled, but the boy only smiled, the smile too wide, too forced. It was clear now. This wasn't the person she thought she had known. This wasn't the same person who had once lived here. The basement around them began to rumble again, louder this time. The walls cracked, and the floor buckled beneath them. The light flickered, as if it too was uncertain whether it should stay. The boy took another step forward, but as he did, the figures in the room stirred, moving closer to him instead of Sarah. It was as if he had become a magnet, drawing the darkness toward him. His face twisted into a grimace, a pained expression, as if the figures were somehow feeding off of him. Suddenly, he screamed an unearthly, high-pitched scream that rattled the windows and made Sarah's skin crawl. The sound of his voice cracked, like glass shattering. In that moment, the ground beneath her feet split again, and the room shifted one final time. The figures stopped moving, their eyes now turned toward the boy. They were no longer shadows, no longer just empty shapes. They were more, something worse. The boy fell to his knees, clutching his head in agony, and as he did, Sarah felt it. The air around her grew thick, like something dark and heavy was pressing against her chest. Her breath caught. Her heartbeat slowed. The boy was changing. He wasn't the one who had been trying to help her. He was the one who had been pulling her into this nightmare all along. Just before Sarah could react, before she could even run, the boy's eyes snapped open, glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. And then, in a voice that was no longer his, he spoke. "This is your end." The basement lights flickered once more before they went out completely, plunging everything into darkness. The figures around them began to move again, faster, closer, and Sarah could feel the floor beneath her feet shifting like it was alive, like the house was devouring itself. Her pulse raced, her skin prickled with fear. The boy had deceived her. She had been the one in danger from the start. And then, just as everything seemed to collapse around her, a scream pierced the silence. It wasn't hers. It wasn't the boy's. It was something else. Something even worse. Everything went dark. The darkness was suffocating. For a long moment, Sarah didn't know if she was alive or dead. She felt weightless, as though the very air around her had vanished, leaving her in a void. Her heart hammered in her chest, the only thing that felt real in this endless blackness. She tried to move, to breathe, but it was like her body had lost all sense of time and space. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, a flicker of light appeared. At first, it was small, like a tiny spark in the distance, but as it grew, it spread like a wave of warmth. Sarah's body responded instinctively, pulling her toward the light as if it were a lifeline. With each step, the shadows around her began to recede. The chilling presence that had suffocated her, fading into the corners of her mind. She found herself standing in the basement again, but it was different. The walls were intact, the lights flickering back to life, as though nothing had ever happened. But something was off. The air felt still, too still. She looked around, confusion clouding her thoughts. The boy, the one who had helped her, or so she thought, was gone. His twisted form had disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of his final words. "This is your end." But she knew it wasn't over. Something had changed. The house was quiet now, too quiet, and the air still carried the weight of whatever dark force had been unleashed. As Sarah slowly walked toward the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every step she took was met with an eerie silence, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. When she finally reached the front door, her fingers hesitated on the handle. She knew she could leave now, but a strange feeling tugged at her. Was she safe? Was this nightmare truly over? Or was this just the calm before the storm? With one last glance at the empty house behind her, she stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap. The rain had stopped, leaving only the faint sound of dripping water from the trees. But even as she stood there, the weight of everything that had happened pressing on her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The boy who had seemed so familiar, so real, had been something else entirely. What had he become? What was he really after? The town was quiet too. The streetlights flickered as Sarah made her way down the path, the feeling of being watched still lingering. Every shadow seemed darker, every corner a little too empty. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had come before her. How many people had entered that house and never left? As she walked further down the road, the weight of the past few hours finally began to settle on her shoulders. She had survived, yes, but she wasn't sure if she'd truly escaped. There were no answers, no sense of closure. Only more questions, swirling in the back of her mind like an unsolved mystery. When Sarah reached her car, she stopped, her hand hovering over the door handle. She wasn't sure why, but she turned back to look at the house one last time. It stood there, silent and still, like it had always been. But something wasn't right. The windows, once dark, seemed to glow with an eerie light, flickering in the distance. She felt a shiver run down her spine, and just as she turned away, she swore she saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly got into the car, locking the door behind her. The engine started with a low rumble, and she drove away without looking back. But the feeling, that lingering sense of unease, stayed with her, even as the house faded from view. Was it truly over? Or was there more to this story than she would ever know? The questions nagged at her as she drove, the night stretching out before her, full of possibilities. The truth was, Sarah didn't know. She didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain: she had survived. For now. And as the rain started to fall again, softly tapping against the windshield, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the nightmare was only just beginning. Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Let me know your thoughts, and if you want more stories like this. And remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you see, they're the ones that stay hidden, waiting for the right moment to come back. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.